Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our second webinar for the SNEP Leadership Exchange on integrated action planning for climate, social, and economic resilience. My name is Tess Clark from Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. We are a SNEP partner, and it's my pleasure to be assisting with the logistics for today's program. For those of you that have joined SNEP webinars before, today's webinar is a little different than usual. Today we will be showcasing the amazing work that's happening in the SNEP Leadership Exchange, which you'll learn all about shortly. But before we get to that, there are a few logistical items to keep in mind. So first, everyone will be on mute just to ensure audio quality. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We look forward to answering those, so please type them in at any time. Additionally, a recording of this webinar will be made available. You can reach that at the SNEP Network website. Just give us 1 to 2 days to get it posted. And lastly, if you'd like a certificate to document your attendance today, please request one by reaching out to Leah Soloway, whose contact information is on your confirmation email. Now for a little bit about the SNEP Network. You can see a map of the Southeast New England program region here. The SNEP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. This webinar series is one of the ways we strive to serve this region, and if you want to know more, you can just check out snepnetwork.org. And on that note, I'd like to hand things over to Joanne Throwe. Joanne is president of Throwe Environmental and senior fellow at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. So Joanne, take it away.
Thanks, Tess, and welcome everyone. Very excited to have this next hour. Not that anyone is doing anything else but focusing on our event today. So thanks for joining us. We're really excited. We had a wonderful conversation this morning in our closed session, and this is our opportunity to share with you some of the highlights. So we have some wonderful guests that joined us today. You heard, hopefully you were with us last month, but you heard a little bit about Wareham, and I'm going to reintroduce them to you shortly. But for now, let me introduce my colleagues working with the SNEP Network on the project team. I have Kyle Gray, who is with us from Rhode Island, and I have Dan Nees for the Center for Resilience Innovation. He is in Maryland, but he is everywhere and working on finance issues. So today from Wareham, representing Wareham, we have Ken Buckland. You'll hear from Ken shortly. He is the Director of Planning and Community Development. He is also the Redevelopment Authority Clerk there. From our case study communities that we invited this month, we did have Mayor Gavin Buckley, who joined our closed session this morning, but he had an emergency to attend to, and he is bringing in his colleague, Teresa Sutherland, who is the former Annapolis city manager, and she joined us this morning. It was a great conversation. You'll hear highlights from Teresa shortly. Caleb Stratton, he is Hoboken's Chief Resilience Officer and also Assistant Business Administrator. So much information to share. And lastly, we have Michelle Paul, who is New Bedford's Director of Environmental Stewardship, and she has done so much in the resilience space. We did something a little different this month. In our closed session, we invited a few other communities to join us and listen in. So as Tess described the SNEP network and some of the work we're doing, so we have this first leadership exchange with Wareham, but we're also working with some other communities. And so we invited them to join us to really share the ideas and the information that are generated from these leadership dialogues. So we had the town of Bourne and Provincetown on the Cape come into the conversation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ken. If you go to the next slide, Tess. All right, so Ken, let's hear a little bit about Wareham. What's going on? Set the stage for some of the activities there.
Thanks, Teresa. Great to be here. For those that aren't familiar with Wareham, we're at the head of Buzzards Bay with 54 miles of coastline. Buzzards Bay is a pretty popular recreation area. We're also at the interstate, two interstates intersect in our town, and we have growing commercial and industrial elements, but our tax base is really 80% residential. We have 24,000 people in the town year-round and double in size in the summer. We have an open town meeting, town administrator, board of selectmen form of government. Our tax rate is less than $11 per thousand. It's essentially a blue-collar town that's voted for change and improvements. We have established a redevelopment authority that has the full powers that a redevelopment authority has, but we want to leverage the change with private capital as much as possible. We see an opportunity. Through town meeting action, they've shown time and again they are open to change and improvement. And our aspirations are cataloged in the economic development strategy that was commissioned by the Redevelopment Authority. And one of our areas of action is downtown. But as typical in a classic New England community, our downtown is on the waterfront and subject to flooding and impacts of sea level change. So our opportunities are going to have to be appropriate to the demands of the environmental resources. And that's what we'd like to get the answers to, some ideas of how to approach the redevelopment of the downtown with the change that's going to be sustainable.
Perfect, Ken. Thank you so much. Now, I know everyone listening to this webinar has also listened to all the podcasts that we made available. To give you a little more context and background on our communities, our invited guests. They were so well done, and you probably heard Kyle Gray's voice in there. So Kyle, I've asked Kyle to set the stage for us on the communities we've invited in to give a brief overview before we begin our discussions. So Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, Joanne. All right, we can move to the next slide, Tess, if that's all right. Thank you. All right, so we're following the same model that we did with our first webinar, if you happen to attend that one. So to relate, the work that we're doing with Wareham, we're bringing in 3 different case studies. We have Annapolis, Maryland, Hoboken, New Jersey, and New Bedford, Massachusetts, 3 cities that have really done tremendous work on resilience. We're seeing a lot of overlap on how we can apply that to Wareham and how we can bring that to the broader region and across the country. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll start off with Annapolis. And so Annapolis is a pre-revolutionary community. You have a city that was colonized in the mid-1600s. So you have a lot of that, old historic and cultural charm. You have brick-lined streets, original facades on buildings. So there are, a ton of cultural and historical assets in the town. In the bottom left, you'll also see City Dock, which is the economic hub of Annapolis. You have commercial assets lining all sides of the street. It's a low-lying area with a parking lot nearby. So, that poses some environmental hazards. And we really see evidence of this going back to 2003. In the top photo, we see Hurricane Isabel, when Annapolis was just inundated with storm surge. And a storm event like this could happen, very regularly by the end of this decade. I think the stat is about 2 times a decade by 2030 that this could happen. So, we're seeing some environmental threats paired with some social and economic resilience issues. But we also see opportunities to improve resilience and to bring in, some different resilience opportunities. So Mayor Gavin Buckley and Teresa Sutherland have kind of led this charge. They have plans to raise City Dock, this downtown area, to accommodate for sea level rise. There's also plans to add in some open space and tie into this project, the Hillman Garage project, which would kind of remediate some of the parking issues by moving the parking into a garage and tie in some more open space in the downtown area. So if we move on to the next slide. So the way we're approaching these resilience case studies is looking at resilience on all 3 fronts. So we have economic resilience, social resilience, and environmental. So the environmental I already touched upon, and those are the big drivers here. Things like sea level rise, climate change, protecting against nuisance flooding and storm surge. But we also see opportunities to bolster our economic assets, everything that's lining City Dock, as well as tying in some of the social components. So whereas right now there's not a lot of open space or public access into the downtown city dock area, we see opportunities to not only bring in, different stakeholders, but also improve that public space and give the public access to the waterfront. So if we move on to the next slide, we can switch to our next case study, which is Hoboken, New Jersey. In the early 2010s, Hoboken was hit with two really devastating hurricanes within a year of each other. We had Hurricane Irene in 2011 and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. This top picture is Hurricane Sandy. That's 500 million gallons of storm surge that went into the city. And again, a Hurricane Sandy scale event could happen very regularly by the end of this decade and even further out. Hoboken's a densely populated area. It's a bedroom community of New York City. It's only about 1 square mile, and almost 60% of the community is a commuter. So that means, the transit system's being heavily relied on, and in Hurricane Sandy, 10 million gallons of stormwater inundated the transit system. So that's a huge social liability, and by bolstering this resilience, we can mitigate that vulnerability while also, working against the environmental threats and improving the economy. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see how Hoboken's done just that. So they're hitting on these, flooding and storm surge issues, touching on green infrastructure with stormwater quality, but we're also working on the economic and social fronts too. So we're creating efficiencies, we're protecting assets against flood risk, and we're minimizing economic insecurity as well. On the social front, we're working to mitigate the commuter issues, enhancing the connectivity to the waterfront. And, Hoboken's really maximizing its Rebuild by Design grant that it got from the Housing and Urban Development Department. It's resisting, delaying, storing, and discharging, the water coming in from different hazards to make for a more resilient community all around. So finally, we can switch to New Bedford. And, New Bedford's right on Buzzards Bay. It's right near Wareham, and there are some significant threats that New Bedford faces that not every community is going to face. New Bedford has the #1 fishing port in the country in terms of dollar value and landings. And with that comes some economic hazards because of sea level rise and increased flooding. There could be up to 2.5 feet of sea level rise in New Bedford by 2050. And then you pile that onto the social challenges that we see as well. With this fishing community in New Bedford, we have a large immigrant population. A third of the residents speak a different language than English at home. Educational attainment's low, poverty's high, income's lower than usual. So we see a lot of environmental justice classifications in New Bedford. And so with that, we see some vulnerability, but also some opportunity to build on that and improve our resilience. So in 2018, New Bedford got the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerabilities Plan Action Grant, and they worked on this New Bedford, the NB Resilient Plan. So that touches on 6 main focus areas, all of which are in this graphic on the bottom right. And those areas are all measured against 4 cross-cutting themes. We have things like equity and empowerment, resilience, city character, greenhouse gas reductions, things like that. And we're seeing how New Bedford is not only addressing resilience from economic and environmental fronts, but also the social front as well. So if we move on to my final slide with these case studies, again, we see we're hitting all 3 target areas. We're leveraging the strengths of our fishing port in New Bedford, ensuring that businesses continue to function amidst the environmental challenges. And we also see, how we can maximize the social areas, work with the EJ communities and the fishing industry to improve resilience and really tie everything together into one multi-hazard resilience plan. So with that, for more information on the case studies, I encourage you to listen to the podcast. We have a couple great episodes with some fantastic interviews. But yeah, I'll turn it back and we can hear directly from these interviewees.
Oh, that's terrific. Great job, Kyle. Thank you. All right, what I want to do now is give some context to the conversation this morning, and I'm going to share with you a few of my takeaways. So this morning I heard about leveraging strengths and understanding how important private partners were, partners across the board, and engaging those partners and really connecting to what is important to the community. In the case of Hoboken, it's their waterfront community. Really connecting resilience experience with the diverse populations, and also identifying needs before solutions. That was a key key point. Also, the town's commitment to the issue and educating and informing, investing in yourself and making sure that you secure that strong commitment from all stakeholders. So what I want to do then is turn, Dan, how about I pick on you for a moment? What were some of your key takeaways today?
Sorry, I'm trying to get my computer to work.
That's okay.
Well, I had a couple of things. The first was, well, there's kind of 1A and 1B. The first was the importance of having projects designed, developed, and in the pipeline ready to go within a broader context, obviously, of resilience planning, because though financing is often, well, should be very much a planned and coordinated strategic activity, a lot of times you're reacting to opportunities. So those communities, and we saw this not just in the 3 communities we were talking to today, but we saw this in other communities too in our past webinar, that those that are ready to go have a tendency to be more efficient in getting resources in place. Connected to that, and we learned this especially with when we were introduced to Hoboken, New Jersey. You'll hear more about this in a minute from Caleb, but the ability to, and the decision to invest in your own community, and it makes a significant, make it a significant part of your financing, goes a long way towards incentivizing other funding like grants, federal and state grants. And so we were really impressed with specifically Hoboken, how they were able to do that. And so their own investment led to more resources coming in. So we often have, everybody likes to get grants, but as I said in our last session, luck favors the prepared, and those communities that prepare by investing have a tendency to get more grant revenue. What I was mostly impressed with was how we had in the conversation this morning a community of just under 3,000 people up to in Provincetown, a community of just under 100,000 people in New Bedford, and then the other communities somewhere in between. And there is just a significant amount of innovation and strategic thinking going on in this space, and resilience, economic development, and community revitalization, and environmental restoration and protection. And it makes some sense, I guess, because these communities, when you're smaller, you don't have the same amount of resources, so you have to be very, very smart, very strategic, and we saw that. We see that in these communities. So I just came away very impressed with the capacity that they have. It was really neat to see.
Thanks, Dan. Kyle, any takeaways for you?
Yeah, I have kind of 2 big ones as well. So first off, I think we heard almost every community talk about how they're leveraging their strengths. And, we heard that differently in each town, whether it was working, with the public and private partners, with the county and the state, leveraging your connectivity to the waterfront. I think we heard from Hoboken, or leveraging the different resilience experiences of diverse environmental justice populations, immigrants, whoever that may be, in New Bedford. We see, every one of these communities leveraging their strengths, building on them, and then I think Caleb Stratton said it in our session this morning, really marrying those strengths to the weaknesses that each community faces. Finding a way to make the strengths, tie into the weakness and turn that into something more. So I think that was one big takeaway. And another one that I saw relates back to the policy process. I found that every community seemed to be in agreement that you really have to nail down your needs before you move on to solutions. So taking some time to define the policy problem that you're faced with, reaching a consensus on what that overall need is, and then letting the public take a little bit of ownership, from there on out. Engaging the public on the process of determining what the solution may be, and giving the public a stake in that process, to make sure that they're involved, they're engaged, educated on what the issues are. But most importantly, really nailing down that policy problem first to make sure you're addressing the root cause.
Thanks, Kyle. So Ken, for Wareham, what did this mean to you, this morning's conversation? Some of the key points that you think resonated with Wareham?
I think Kyle's last point was key, that this idea that we have to carefully craft a statement of need and let better actors decide on what the solutions could or should be, how we approach these problems. I think that the first part of developing the the consensus around what the statement of need is kind of key.
Thank you. All right, so what I want to do now is hear from our guests. I'm going to tee you up with a few questions, folks. So things that came out this morning, I'm going to start with, let's start with leveraging strengths that we heard about this morning. And this would be for, let's start with Annapolis. You know, you're talking about your community strengths and how to address some of the weaknesses. And we talked about that, some of the vulnerabilities that you have, and really moving forward on your strengths and building from there. Could you talk, Teresa, a little bit more about Annapolis's approach to that? Teresa, you're muted.
Sorry.
There you go. That's all right.
As Mayor Buckley came in, addressing resilience and city dock problems was one of his biggest priorities. The city of Annapolis has seen, I think it was a 425% increase in nuisance flooding in the last 50 years, according to NOAA, a greater increase than any place in the nation. And every time city dock floods, all those businesses close and people can't travel the streets because the streets are flooded. So that was a big priority to Gavin, but we also needed to get the financial house in order before we could do that, because you got to do the necessary before you can do the possible. So if you can't afford to take on more debt, if you can't pay your everyday bills, you're not going to be able to address your resilience problems. So we first took that step. Then as we looked at what we wanted to do at City Dock, we knew that we needed to address environmental issues. We knew there were economic issues. And rather than dictate the solution, we identified the problem. We then brought in, formed a City Dock Action Committee to try and come up with what are the concepts of how do we want City Dock to look? What do we want City Dock to be, without saying how we were going to get there? Just what do we want it to be? And then the third component was we partnered, and these partnerships were vital to what we're doing, with the Naval Academy, with the federal government, FEMA and MEMA, with the state government, and with Anne Arundel County. And we got statewide legislation passed to enable counties and municipalities to form resilience financing authorities. And by partnering with the county, we hope to do that, to do resilience projects both in the city and the county that are beneficial to all of our residents. One of the weaknesses of the city is it has very limited revenue streams. 70% of our revenue is from property taxes, and the taxpayers are not going to tolerate us raising property taxes enough to pay for a $50 million project at City Dock. So it was very important for us to partner to go with this resilience financing authority that will allow a multitude of different financing sources that we potentially can tap into with the county, who has broader authority on different revenue sources. So the partnerships were very, very important. Reaching consensus on the need, reaching consensus on the concept of where you wanted to go without dictating how to get there, I think were very important to our success so far.
Thanks, Teresa. Okay, Caleb, I'm going to ask you this question. So we started talking about commitment, and there's a certain level of commitment that's needed of a town or a city, investing in yourself and securing that strong commitment, right? You've been so successful, Hoboken has been so successful at pursuing and acquiring grants, also looking at different financing streams. But my question for you is, so what kind of commitment is necessary from the town or city to pursue a more comprehensive resilience initiative? What does a town need to do and be willing to change in order to invest in their community on resilience?
I think the important thing is to agree on what the challenges that the community faces are. So an example of that would be, for Hoboken, 75% of our community is in the coastal floodplain. And that equates to about $7.8 million in payments to the flood insurance, National Flood Insurance Program, over 9,800 policies. But if you were to take a step back and look at our total rateable base, it's about more than $2 billion in assets that are in the floodplain. So we may not agree on what is necessarily, or members of the community might not necessarily agree on what's driving change or what the appropriate actions are to address, but the cost of inaction is extraordinarily high. And so we presented information that looked at different areas and different investments that we can make, recognizing that hospital, fire stations, substations, housing authority, and both commercial and residential assets are in the floodplain. So to take, and moreover, Hoboken is a city that was built more than 100 years ago. So we have aging infrastructure in the floodplain. We have historic properties. So we agreed that we needed to address resiliency and reduce risk. And we coalesced around a comprehensive water management strategy rather than all those different interests heading in different directions, with the goals of reducing insurance costs that aren't an active investment in the community, that's money from the community going outside of the community, and invest in assets that improve social, economic, and ecological health of the community. And so that's what I think was one of the important places to start, is to come to common points of understanding and agreement. And then once you have that, you can begin to articulate a vision. Once you have a vision, you can begin to articulate a plan. And then once you have the plans, you can put them into designs, and designs lead to financing and projects. And it's been 8 years for us, really 8 or 9 years for us. So it takes time.
Thanks, Caleb. So Michelle, question for you. So we talked about environmental justice a little bit this morning, the social aspect of resilience. And, New Bedford is just such an amazing, diverse community, so much going on there. But you spoke about meeting people where they are, in the community, and leveraging the strengths of an environmental justice community. So you are really good in your climate resilience plan in engaging all aspects of the community. But we know that that's not always easy to do, right? And sometimes, tying all the co-benefits of resilience and making sure that all voices are heard, that some communities find a struggle with that. So I'd love for you to be able to speak how to integrate the economic and the environmental, the social aspects, and how you're proceeding with that with New Bedford.
Yeah, it's, definitely people need to survive before they can thrive. And a lot of the folks in the environmental justice communities are really struggling just to get by day after day. Especially with this pandemic, it hit our environmental justice communities very hard, because you've got sometimes multi-families living in one living unit. Certainly hard to quarantine or socially isolate. A lot of people are working in industrial settings where they can't always socially distance. So it's been very difficult, and the language barriers don't help either. So it's one thing for the city to complete resilience projects with our infrastructure, and sometimes it doesn't translate to the people in the communities. So really being able to listen to our vulnerable populations. A lot of our immigrant communities, they have already been climate refugees. Some came from Puerto Rico, some came from Cape Verde, some came from South America. So we've got a lot of great culture. and a lot of great things to learn from folks and how they have already survived climate changes. Our fishing industry, our frontline work, you know, we have the #1 fishing port in the nation, as Kyle had said. So that's very important to our identity. That's very important to our economy. But our frontline workers have already seen a lot of the impacts of climate change with species migration. If you have a license to fish a certain species in a certain area, and those fish migrate to a different area, you can't always keep up. The permit, by the time you get a new permit for a new area for a new species, that fish has moved on already. So we've already seen a lot of our frontline workers, they don't have full-time jobs anymore because the fish houses can't keep up with, you know, there used to be 3 shifts a day, and now, you know, people have either been sent home at noontime after a half shift or been replaced with temporary workers. A lot of our folks in the urban core, they struggle more with you know, heat waves than most of us do, because they're in a tenement house that was probably built in the 30s around industry, and the home may not either have central air conditioning, maybe the windows are not structurally able to hold a unit air conditioner, and a lot of folks can't afford the air conditioner or the power to run it. So, you know, these types of things are really exacerbated in those environmental justice communities. A lot of times there are, you know, multiple stressors. So we really, it's really important to understand, really get into the community, talk to the people in the community, and really listen. Don't just dictate to them how to become more resilient, but listen to what they're already going through and learn from them so that we can share with the rest of the community.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great. I appreciate that. Dan, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess this is for all three. And well, quite simply, I'm wondering what you envision the current economic crisis, which, you know, could go on for some time, since it's directly linked to something completely out of our direct control, which is the COVID crisis, how you see this impacting your decisions as it relates to resilience, especially your financing and funding decisions related to resilience, and if it's causing you to step back or you see the even greater need and so you're trying to ramp things up. Just specifically, how do you anticipate being impacted moving forward? We could start with Caleb and then Michelle and Teresa.
So I'm glad you asked this question. It's been so the first thing I did when I went into the acting business administration position is I handed out layoff notices to 550 employees, because in civil service we have to notice every person, even if they're in a different union. And we ultimately laid off 30 municipal employees in May. And we have a $118 million budget, and we undershot that by about $8 million this year. And we had a municipal tax increase of 7.8%, which is the highest in the last decade. And we have not gotten clear guidance on, you know, how we're going to address this next year. But I expect that we're projecting that our fiscal position will be worse next year because of a number of different factors. But, you know, we collect a lot of our budget is balanced through parking revenue and other revenue streams that I think are more fragile than not right now. So that is important because our resilience projects are, for the most part, outside of our traditional budgetary processes, because we're funded through our open space tax or through grants or through federal federal awards. But the reason why I'm concerned about it is because I think that we have a 14% pension contribution increase next year, and our year-over-year healthcare costs. And if you look at our total budget, like 75% of our budget is just police and fire salaries and those other long-term obligations. So our layoffs were cut from the smallest sector of the pie, and that smallest sector is where our professional staff is, where we have discretionary spending in engineering, where we have legal contracts. So I think that it is going to slow down and in some cases stop the progression of our project. So for an example, we did a $12 million project in Southwest Hoboken that was a surface park, and it had 200,000 gallons of subsurface storage. We were in eminent domain proceedings to acquire the property adjacent to that, which we have stalled because the council has provided direction and the mayor has, we have minority basically on the council that supports the mayor. So we don't have support for legal contracts, acquisition costs. They're not willing to obligate funds towards certain projects that reduce flood risk. Basically, like, this COVID-19 has shifted from resilience is the most important thing that we have to address in the community towards do what you've already started, but manage our finances better. And it's a pretty difficult, municipalities are in a really difficult position. And but for CARES Act V2, or I think that New Jersey has authorized revenue loss. We can bond for revenue loss, but that's not a fiscal strategy that I support or recommend. So there's going to be a lot of belt tightening, and I think it's going to be worse next year than it was this year. And one of our counselors that I trust says, like, I'm in the valley right now. I can't really see where we're going. So don't make big decisions, which means reducing spending, not taking on debt, those kind of things. It's going to be interesting, but I wish that wasn't such a negative response. But it's been a long year. So
a realistic and understandable response, but it'd be interesting to hear from New Bedford. Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, largely in the same boat, so to speak. Our revenues are down, unemployment is up, but this is kind of a threat that we hadn't really thought about in our resilience planning. We were thinking about weather. We really weren't. I mean, we kind of had, pandemic or, on the back burner, but it wasn't something that we were planning for. But I think that there are opportunities to come out of this stronger. Obviously, it's certainly not anything that we're ever going to be glad happened. But we had been in a unique position. There had been a couple of elderly housing homes that had gone under a couple of years ago, and the city was able to acquire those properties to set up COVID recovery centers. So, we were able to take that negative that happened a couple of years ago and see the opportunity to help us out in this, in this current environment. So it's being creative about those things. It's harder for me to keep up with what other departments are doing because I'm working remotely. We're all working remotely. There are only a couple of city departments that are open on a very limited basis. So it's harder that way. It's much better to understand what the other departments are doing, so that way when opportunities do come along, then you can leverage the other work that the other departments are doing as part of the project to kind of show that you're putting skin in the game. But I think we are getting better at the working cohesively while apart.
That's great. Thank you. Teresa?
Yes, so I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage in addressing this because I left the city 9 months ago. My last day was January 31st, right before COVID hit. What good timing I had. But a lot of the city, so as I said, 70% of city revenue is from property taxes. That's a weakness in that you only have one good revenue source, but it's also a strength. It's a very steady revenue source. Here, assessments on residential are increasing, but we don't know where the commercial assessments are going to come in. We also rely heavily on the tourism industry. It's probably our biggest industry. So parking revenue and hotel taxes are non-existent, and we have about a $3 million budget hole for fiscal year 21 that's going to be worse in 22 unless we can bring our recurring costs down to match our recurring revenues. Fortunately, in those first 2 years of Gavin's term, we were able to bring structural balance to our budget and have enough in reserves that we were just getting to a AAA almost bond rating, but a AA plus with a positive outlook. We were moving in the right direction. So going into COVID, we were in a good place, which is a strength that we had. But when we looked at doing City Dock, part of it was, hey, we've got a parking garage. A parking garage generates revenue. And let's put this on the tourists. We'll use hotel tax to pay for it as a possible revenue source. Well, parking and hotel taxes are non-existent right now. So I can't really say where we are moving forward. I can't imagine that it will move as quickly as it otherwise would have if COVID hadn't hit. And it will also give us opportunities to explore other revenue sources. I know there was talk about selling fiber optic. What are the other ways we can do this? Because hotel taxes and parking taxes might not be as reliable as we always thought they were. So it's definitely an issue.
Thanks, Teresa. I welcome questions. Oh, Ken, go ahead.
Just because there are a couple of things going on that affect what we're trying to accomplish as well. One is that the residential demand has not slowed down, and in fact has started to increase a little bit in terms of the value of residential development. And that comes from, I believe, the migration of people out of urban centers to the more rural areas. And we're not rural at all in any real sense of the word, even though we have a great cranberry industry. But we're more suburban, and we become an attractive location for escaping crowded centers. The other aspect of the change that affects the mixed-use development on the waterfront is the change in the brick and mortar retail and how that's being affected by the online sales, and as well as the idea of home offices being more popular and affecting office development. So we have two things happening here. One is, on one side is the potential for an increased demand for housing, and the other is the potential for a softer commercial sector as well.
Thanks, Ken. Kyle, I wanted to check with you. Any questions? We welcome everybody's questions for the remaining amount of time for the webinar, but Kyle, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Before I get to that, I just want to double down on what I think the last four people just said. I think, addressing resilience prior to, a hazard, not that anyone could have prepared for COVID. I mean, especially, a municipality could not have foreseen that coming. But, having a system on the ground and projects in the pipeline and just the framework ready to, engage on resilience projects, I think that puts you in a better position. And I think that was a topic that we touched on earlier this morning, being prepared before you expect anything to happen, because that's really the backbone of resilience, is you don't know what's going to happen necessarily, but you're prepared for it. So that was just something I thought was interesting. In the chat, we do have one question directed for New Bedford. This one has to do with contaminated sediment in the harbor. So how do you deal with contamination issues amidst all of these resilience challenges?
Yeah, so that actually, that is one of my main challenges, coming from an older industrial city where a lot of our businesses were on the waterfront. One business in particular, Aerovox, resulted in the contamination of the harbor. We've got 2 Superfund sites in the city. So we have to make sure that when we have an assessment and cleanup project, that is not only going to create a condition of no risk of exposure today, but we've got to look at that in 50 years, in 100 years, and particularly a lot of the contaminants that we deal with are persistent, like polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. Those are very persistent in the environment. Those are going to last for hundreds of years. So when we're looking at a contaminated property that's on the harbor, we have to make sure that we're looking at sea level rise projections, not just into 2100, but we're looking beyond that. We need to make sure that the cleanup is resilient. There were a couple of cases I know of areas more on the south shore of Massachusetts or on the eastern side where they really got slammed by nor'easters about 3 years ago, and there were a couple of properties that had been capped, and because of the nor'easter and the velocity with which they got hit, they really had an issue. There were a couple of contaminated properties where the cap was undermined, and they had to go back in and re-clean up. So we certainly, EPA has been spending 30 years cleaning up the harbor, so we want to make sure that that's not going to happen again. We're not going to, our whatever cleanup strategy is used at these properties is not going to just be sufficient for the next 50 years. We have to look literally hundreds of years down the road. So it is a very big challenge.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And then one other question, that kind of relates back to our first webinar on green infrastructure. In that webinar, we heard that building green infrastructure into the character of your community can kind of change the feel or the image of your town to new residents coming in, or the people who already live there. So I'm thinking, applying this to resilience, how can developing your community as a more resilient, a resilient hub, how can that draw in outside visitors or residents, and how can that change the image or the vision of your community for those who already live and work there? So maybe if Caleb and then Teresa want to start, and then Michelle.
I think that the simplest way to answer that is, Teresa had made a comment about getting your house in order before taking on additional measures, but for the investments that we've made, I don't think that we would have had our house in order. So it's we want to continue to support our business community, our residences, and to do that, we have to address the impacts of climate change and adapt to almost all of our city systems in a comprehensive and thoughtful manner. So former Mayor Don Zinner worked very hard to get our AA+ bond rating up to standards that we could sustain. And for us to do that, we need to have a coastal flood risk reduction strategy, a rainfall flood risk strategy, a storm sewer separation strategy, a bulkhead, replacement and improvement strategy. And so those things are what I would argue underpin all the other economic and social standards that we have in the community. So it's comprehensive, but it's also pervades every city department, all of our projects. I think that it was Michelle was saying one thing that we have been successful in doing is layering projects. So if we're doing a road project, how do we make that a resilient project? If we're doing a water main project, how do we make that a resilient project? And adding little pieces, whether that's green infrastructure and bump outs to reduce crossing distances, or if it's actually laying conduit to as a piece of city-owned infrastructure, since we already have the road open, or if it's providing concessions in spaces that were previously underutilized. So I think that there's a lot of ways to add value to projects and to do it with a resilient focus.
Caleb, I had to step out for a minute. I only heard the last part of the question. Could you repeat the question, please?
Absolutely. Yep. So, yep. In our first webinar, we heard a lot about building green infrastructure into the character of a city to, draw in new residents or to just improve the vision of your community, the image of your community to outside residents or visitors. So, how do you think resilience can do that? How can it change the character of your community and, change the overall feel for visitors, residents, business owners alike?
Right. So the city of Annapolis, sometimes described as a tale of two cities. We have a very wealthy population, and we have a good portion of our residents are living in poverty. They live in public housing. We have a large amount of public and subsidized housing. And so one of Gavin's visions, Mayor Buckley's visions, is one Annapolis. And so we have redevelopment of these public housing projects coming up. One's recently demolished and being redeveloped, and there will be others coming up in the next 5 to 7 years. Some of those communities are on the waterfront, yet the people don't have access to use the water and so as we do projects with the Housing Authority, which is actually a separate entity from the city, we are looking at incorporating resilience, environmental enhancements, environmental protection, access for our residents who right now don't have access. And then in addition, for City Dock, as we look at City Dock and Hillman Garage, we're also looking at transportation. Can we reduce parking by enhancing transportation? If we enhance transportation, that's going to benefit our most vulnerable residents, because when resilience hits, it's your most vulnerable residents that you need to help the most. And so as our capital projects are planned, we've developed a resilience plan. We're considering what those things take and how we can build that into each capital project that we undertake.
Michelle, to wrap up the question.
Sure. Yeah. It definitely being resilient and taking resilience actions definitely makes the community more livable, more desirable. Our economic development director used to just accuse me of just trying to scare him with the whole climate change thing. But then as the different departments and as he realized that there actually are opportunities to be had here, because a business is going to want to relocate and a family is going to want to relocate to a community that is out in front of something. So, as we are more proactive and achieving different resilience goals, it makes the city of New Bedford more attractive to businesses, to families, especially young families. So it really does. It really puts the community in a very good position to, and I've heard this before, instead of bouncing back from a disaster, you bounce forward. So that way we are better able to recover from different things that happen. And as that recovery is apparent to people in the city, and they understand that part of that is because we planned for it beforehand, then that gives people more confidence in government's ability to set us up for success.
Okay, so we've just got maybe 3 minutes left, and Michelle, I'm going to start with you. We ended our morning session with a takeaway, just a key takeaway quickly from what you could share based on New Bedford's experience with Wareham and other communities.
Sure.
One key takeaway.
All right. That's tough. I think it's just getting everybody to realize that that it's not a chore to be resilient. It's going to save money in the long run. It is forethinking, and it is just rebuilding better and really making sure that we look at our actions with that equity lens to make sure that we're bringing everybody along with us.
Perfect. Okay, Caleb, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that having a resilience strategy and implementing resilience projects is about breaking down silos and working through issues to stay focused on goals that are driven by community feedback and meant to support the community.
Thank you. Teresa, final word.
I would say my takeaways are think broadly. Think broadly because there are zillions of alternatives out there. And let others bring some of those alternatives to you and be open-minded about them. And I really liked what Caleb said this morning about avoid constituent groups coalescing around a common point of opposition. You've got to build consensus and partnerships in order to have people buy in to what you're trying to do. And just one more thing that kind of touched on our last thing about the bond rating agencies. I think one of the reasons we got our positive outlook is that they like that we know resilience is a problem, that we're dealing with resilience, that we have a plan, and that when our downtown and our community is resilient, everybody is resilient. So I think those partnerships and just being very broad-minded in solutions is going to be helpful.
Great way to end this. So for Wareham, we have given you a lot to think about, but we are continuing to give you quite a bit to think about. As our next webinar on December 2nd, we will be covering waterfront revitalization and redevelopment. So we have Boston, Chattanooga, and Burlington, Vermont joining us. So I hope everybody registers. And then the last one will be January 6th. So we've got a great feedback to already offer Wareham. Ken, I hope today was useful for you. I want to thank all our guests. You guys were wonderful. And thanks for everybody joining in this conversation this afternoon. Thanks. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Stay
Thank
well.
you.